Whoa, okay, relax. Brian? Put the gun down, we can talk about this. The title of this video sounds kind of harsh, but if there's one thing I want to make clear at the beginning, it's that I promise I'm not here to just shit on your favorite video game. I think a lot of the games I talk about in this video are actually objectively very good, and if anything, I'm envious of the people who like these games, because the games I love I get a solid 10 hours out of. The games you love you can hit a smooth 200. Do you know how much money I've spent on games that end faster than the critique videos on RPG games? A lot of money, roughly 100 lots of money. I do like some of these games as well, even the ones that I can't get into. I know they're very good games. Mass Effect 2 I've tried playing twice and got 20 hours in both times, and I just wasn't getting into it. And I know, blasphemy, that game I know is great, I couldn't stick with it. I tried playing Horizon Zero Dawn 3 times, same result. I had 80 hours in The Witcher 3, some people's game of the decade, through the first 2 acts, and then I wound up just never finishing it after I tried sitting down and playing it every day for weeks on end, and each time just saying, I don't know if I'm in the mood for this. My friend Anthony recommended this game to me, and he just started watching my videos, so if he's watching this, I'm sorry. I like the game, dude. I liked it enough to buy merch for it, just not enough to actually finish the game, so yeah, figure that one out. A lot of my biggest issues with some of these titles are personal preference, albeit ones that I believe a good handful of people would agree with, but there's also, to me at least, straight up objective issues that have plagued this genre for years that have yet to be addressed by the developers who make these games. And I'll be talking about both of these types of issues going forward. Now, while this video might sound like a list of complaints, to me it's just a way to talk about how to potentially improve the genre, and also a way to actually change my mind on it. I want people to watch this and say they disagree with a lot of what I'm saying. If you feel that way, please leave a comment explaining your thoughts, because I want to be on your side. I want to be excited for the next big RPG that comes out, and I'm hoping new perspectives will help me go into these games with a different angle or attitude, and I can finally start enjoying some of these titles. Finally, I know that RPG is a very broad term, and its definition is a bit weird, and it's hard to tell where the line is that makes something an RPG or not, and because of that, originally I made a list of things that the game had to check off to be counted as an RPG, but I couldn't really compile any type of checklist that didn't leave out games that definitely feel and play like RPGs, or included games that definitely aren't. So we're just gonna go with our gut feeling. Not everything I talk about will apply to every single game we think of as an RPG, but that's what we get for having such ill-defined genres in gaming. Now this intro has gone long enough, let's talk about There's this general understanding with RPG games that never really struck me as odd until very recently, and it's that the core combat mechanics in a lot of these titles do not feel very fun or satisfying. A lot of reviews when talking about the gunplay, for example, in an RPG title will say it's good for an RPG game. I made a video on Atomic Heart a couple weeks ago, and I mentioned a Russian journalist who got to play the game and how he mentioned that the shooting felt shooter good, not RPG good, in order to ease people's minds on the quality of the combat, and to me at least, I find that weird. That a whole genre of games we just kind of judge at a lower bar for quality in this very key element. The fact that these games can feel hollow or not very impactful and it's just what's expected is odd. Is that just me? Maybe it's just me who thinks that's weird, but at the very least, I do think that the lack of satisfying game feel is a serious problem. A game with mediocre or flat gameplay does not automatically disqualify it from being good. I love the Uncharted games to hell and back, but the original 3 were nothing exceptional in their cover shooting mechanics. However, each of these games were able to be completed in under a dozen hours, and they created so many scenarios that made your gameplay way more exciting and gave you extra things to juggle, like being in a building that was falling down and pushing you off the edge, or fighting on a moving train. I can deal with okay combat with some twists for 10 hours, but when I have to deal with okay combat for 60 hours, and for the most part it's always the same thing, my eyes start rolling back in my head. Obviously you fight bosses, so you might think, oh, that's a way to spice up combat, but unless you're basically a full ARPG like the Souls games, all of these bosses are sorta just damage sponges and nothing more. On top of that, in a lot of these games you can just run into people in the middle of a field or something and start fighting during your backtracking or explorations, so you're constantly being pushed into something that isn't fun for many hours on end. And the thing that bugs me is that this does feel like a fixable issue. The Witcher 3 has all the ingredients for fun combat, but because your attacks are animation based, which is basically when you press the attack button, one of a certain set of animations will play out, which may vary in length, which is annoying in itself, these attacks lose all the impact that a game like Bloodborne has, because you're basically watching a mini cutscene as your attack. I actually played both of these games concurrently, and I think that what killed The Witcher for me ultimately was that I never found the combat to be very fun, and it was way too long of a game for me to deal with the core mechanics mechanic like that not being enjoyable. ARPGs have this down, but other RPG games need to start bringing the bar up a little. I recognize that these games are deep and filled with so many mechanics, but not committing to arguably one of the main ones for a lot of these games feels very negligent. The next couple of issues are a little bit faster and have a bit more to do with open world games, but usually these two go hand in hand, so I feel like it's worth bringing up, however briefly. A lot of open world maps are way too big and not filled with enough content. It feels like at a certain point these games realize the optics of having a huge world. People would go crazy for an open world that's 2, 3, 4 times bigger than the last one, but the change ends up very superficial. Either the amount of content was completely unchanged, which leads to barren wastelands with nothing in them, like for example Biomutant, or the devs just kind of hit the ×2 button and duplicated stuff that was already there, so the map is filled with stuff, but it's just the same 5 things 300 times each. When we get to leveling in a second, I'll touch more on filler content, but a lot of RPGs are notorious for absolutely skyrocketing their game's length by using the most basic repetitive filler content that shows up on your map like a world of things to explore, but really to me most of the time it just looks like a list of chores. In way too many of these games, getting new weapons or equipment does not feel nearly as exciting as it should because the game wants to give you a constant stream of it, but the same way that excess supply leads to less people actually wanting something, excess weapons make each one feel way less cool than it should. Weapons are outclassed so fast that the excitement for a new one basically disappears immediately. Unless you're grinding like crazy, a lot of the time you'll only be able to afford a good weapon from a merchant once the rough stats of what you're already getting as loot has caught up with the stats of a purchasable weapon. Why would I spend so much money to buy a sword if 15 minutes later I beat a quest and I get a better reward? Now I just wasted a shit ton of money for no reason. It's okay in some cases because the special properties of a weapon might be interesting, like in Borderlands where sometimes reloading causes an explosion to deal damage, or a gun might shoot a bunch of bullets but only drop your ammo by 1, so there are more reasons as to why you'd keep one weapon over another, but in a lot of games it just comes down to a damage boost or a small buff percentage change. This weapon does 3% fire damage, while this one does 3.2% ice damage. Okay. One of the biggest draws of an RPG game is that you're able to play it in the way that you want. You have total freedom in how you want to play. So why is it that I feel like I'm either forced to do a heap of side content that I don't want to do, or I'm forced to stop myself from doing too much side content and making the game feel like a joke? The new Assassin's Creed games are ripped on for this, and I don't even hate these games, but they're probably some of the most blatantly overbloated titles ever. If you only take a small interest in the side content, which is nowhere near as interesting as a lot of the side stuff you find in games like The Witcher, you're punished for it. You become way too low of a level to have any shot at continuing, so if you want to keep playing the game, you need to sink dozens of hours into monotonous, underwritten quests, or on a massive collectathon, which isn't as fun as proper collectathons because the movement and platforming is nowhere near as interesting, so the challenge of collecting stuff is just in the running towards the place where the thing is. Conversely, I felt like I had to stop myself from doing too many side quests in The Witcher because if I didn't, then the balance would be thrown off. I'd be way too high of a level in every single mission and then get bored with every combat encounter because all I was doing was slicing through Swiss cheese. There was no resistance. And turning the difficulty up, I felt like I was turning on a new game. The spike from one setting to another felt very poorly thought out, so I felt like the only way I could have fun with the main game was by limiting how much I did the side activities. But that sucked because some of my favorite stuff in this game were those side activities. I think the current state of the leveling system does the exact opposite of what RPGs are designed for. It feels like the game is forcing me to play a specified way in order to actually enjoy myself, or even to just play it altogether. I really truly don't understand the reasoning behind inventory limits. Games that do this become unnecessarily tedious and annoying. Inventory limits are not native to RPGs, but RPGs are usually where they feel the most useless. Other games like Resident Evil 2, for example, limited inventory is part of the strategy. You need to make difficult decisions and potentially leave things that could be useful. It adds to the feeling of being a desperate survivor. They also have this great size system with their inventory, so even the menuing part of it feels intelligent and interesting. Nier Automata does something similar with its upgrades, which of course is different, but the intelligence systems for this kind of stuff is a huge bonus. I also understand specific limits on certain items like health, at least at any one time, and so you can't spam healing and now nothing is any real threat to you. But when it's just knickknacks or keeping extra weapons that I like, why is this a thing? The inventory feels big enough for it to have nothing to do with proper strategy, so is it like for realism? How many people have actually thought, alright, I know I fight dragons and giant spiders in this game, but I swear to God if I can carry more than 7 iron pans, this will lose my suspension of disbelief. Weight limits on your person themselves also make sense because then you need to be a bit more strategic on which armor you want to keep and what you want to sacrifice. It stops you from just turning OP and there's some depth to it. Maybe there are upgrades to the weight of armor you can have so you can put resources into that if you want to prioritize high defense. It adds a little strategy. My favorite system for this is, surprise surprise, in the Souls games. You have an armor limit, but but there are also intermediate points where more or less armor means you roll slower or faster. That gives you so many options, it affects gameplay properly, and you can gain one thing at the cost of another. But normal inventory limits feel like such artificial roadblocks that are a moment-to-moment inconvenience. I would really rather not spend my resources on getting rid of a contrived annoyance if I can spend it on good upgrades, but then the game punishes me for that by making inventory management a massive problem. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in the gameplay section, and this is probably the least universal thing that these games have, but I have to mention it because it's maybe my least favorite mechanic in video games, and it happens in RPGs sometimes. I seriously can't describe how much I hate this. Weapon breaking. I hated this in Breath of the Wild. It was literally this massive opposing force to all the other amazing things that this game did. It's like Nintendo was specifically talking to me and going, hey look, we made this amazing game, but also, fuck you, guy. But at the very least, this game committed to actually making this a substantial gameplay mechanic. Even though I hated it, it had an actual purpose. Your weapons would fully break, so you'd have to keep moving on and finding the next one, finding weapons all over the place, being resourceful if you had no weapon whatsoever. What's worse to me is when a game does this for no reason other than, again, maybe realism? I've picked on The Witcher 3 already in this video, and I'm gonna do a little bit coming up too, and I feel bad because obviously this video isn't designed to talk about the good parts of that game, and it is a good game, but seriously, this is so annoying. It's just a way to siphon away some of the money that I've accumulated while playing, or force me to use a different weapon or piece of armor, but again, it's not done intelligently, it's just kind of shoved in there like, ha, here, deal with this, I guess. Why Bloodborne decided to do this after all the Souls games before it didn't is baffling to me, especially considering that system makes way more sense in those games where there are actually more weapons, they're more disposable, and you have actual blacksmiths. But it did it, and all it did was occasionally inconvenience me in the middle of a boss, and I was kind of screwed because I'd lose all my souls to that boss because I was doing 2 damage, so I either got to switch entirely to a different weapon or grind a bunch of small enemies to get the souls to fix the weapon, the cost for which goes up every time you do it. Why? Why? Stop it. I hate it. Stop doing it. It's stupid, and I can't stand it. I know some people have other gameplay issues with RPGs, for example, basic and uninteresting skill trees or crafting systems, but a lot of the time I can just ignore those or avoid them, or they don't provide a big enough annoyance to me personally, so I won't get into them here. I know I listed a lot of negative gameplay elements since, well, that's what the video is about, but don't think for a second that I don't recognize the gameplay elements that are done really well in RPGs. I love how much choice you have in how to tackle your enemies in a lot of these games. I like being able to be a specialist in something and play to my strengths or the things that I enjoy, while also having the option to be more of a jack of all trades. And of course, the biggest thing, the freedom of exploration, all the hidden caves and crevices that you can find and potentially discover new stories or items in. But the stuff that I mentioned in this section can be a real hindrance to my enjoyment, and they're so present in the moment-to-moment gameplay that it almost always feels like I have a massive anchor on my back dragging me down as I try to have fun. Still, I think I'd be able to move past a lot of this stuff, especially since not all games have all of these issues, if I didn't have such a big problem with RPG stories. I will openly admit that I don't thrive in sandbox settings in a video game. I never know what to do. When I'm just given tools and I can do whatever I want, I get the same reaction as I do when somebody asks a question like, what's your favorite song? My brain just starts collapsing in on itself and I forget every song that I've ever heard of in my entire life. Somebody actually asked me this question a few days ago, and my first thought was Coffee Bean by Travis Scott. That's not even one of my top 5 favorite songs on that album. Why did I think that? Still, I won't throw hands at Minecraft because my inability to handle structureless gameplay is an issue with me, not the game. In the same way, I wouldn't clown an RPG like Stardew Valley for the same thing. It's committing to something that just isn't for me, so it's not poorly done, it's just not my thing. Story, on the other hand, is my thing, and a lot of RPGs have stories that keep you moving on to the next thing. They dictate missions and maybe what upgrades you get, and they justify why you're doing what you're doing outside of you just dicking around in the world. They are important, and while I know a lot of people can ignore the story and just enjoy messing around in the world of these RPGs, that's a big thing with Skyrim, for example. As someone on a different end of that spectrum who needs in-game motivation and structure, these games can often fall entirely flat on their faces and fail to engage me in any way like they should. First and foremost, these stories are designed to not be engaging. If they were too engaging, you'd want to keep mainlining the game, and the massive stretches of time where not much story stuff is happening would feel very frustrating. So instead, a lot of these stories have a very vague premise: find your son, find Ciri, and then you move forward at a snail's pace in terms of new developments. Instead of a proper story, it almost feels like a bland excuse for what you're doing, like, you're stabbing the bad guys cause, They burn down your village. Yeah, they burn down your village, go get revenge, and then 40 hours later, after you've been messing around playing card games and fighting level 1 rats for XP the whole time, just meandering around, you get to the guy that burned down his village and he throws smoke at his feet and disappears. Oh nice, it's Act 2, go find him in his new hideout. I get it, it's done because if they treated these things too urgently, it would get in the way of you going around doing side quests and exploring. You'd feel like you have to keep going with the story, but then make the overarching story accordingly lax. It takes me out of it entirely when in cutscenes characters act like there are imminent dangers or a character might be lost or dead, and I'm out finding someone's stupid goat 10 minutes later. Ludonarrative dissonance. It's that fancy word that makes you sound super smart, but all it is that gameplay actions do not match what the story seems to be doing. Nathan Drake does not want to use real guns on security guards. He also mows down anything in his path with an assault rifle. But at the very least, I feel like I can enjoy these stories on their own, removed from my gameplay actions. When your story is straight up built around the idea that the player should be able to easily not care about it for dozens of hours on end, or worse yet, it's not built around that idea and it acts important but its significant moments are so sparse that they disappear into ash, they leave almost no impact on the player and never allow your potentially interesting ideas to flourish. On the occasions where games actually try to justify the reason for doing side activities into the main storyline, maybe a king will only trust you once you've earned a certain reputation, for example, it can really bridge the gap between gameplay and story. But as it stands, I feel like RPGs over-rely on normal storytelling methods but shove them into a genre where everything is stretched insanely thin. It's just not a good mesh, and RPGs need to find a better way to marry their story decisions with their gameplay openness. One thing that I actually like about RPG stories is that you have the ability to have agency in how it plays out. There's an argument to be had about how games usually only care about a handful of decisions to figure out what ending you get, despite you making 100 decisions throughout the game. Most infamously, Mass Effect 3, your decisions carried over from game to game, so the amount of choices you made is too many to count, and in the end it basically affects nothing about the final conclusion. But although I'll shame them a bit for giving you somewhat hollow agency, considering how friggin' impossible it is to try and come up with the endings for all of these variables, and also since at least in the short term they can have an effect on relationships or the plans your characters have, I will give it a pass. However, the existence of dialogue choices specifically do have a severe effect on the writing and especially the acting in these games. Using Fallout 4 as an example, it feels like every conversation goes like this. The game keeps prompting you to respond to whatever a character says and then they react accordingly, and for a split second it feels like you actually did something, but it turns out no matter what you say, ultimately you keep coming back to the same spot as somebody who picked a completely different path. And like I said, to an extent I can excuse this, but also it means that effectively the same conversation needs to get written dozens of different ways, and not all of those are going to be winners. It's hard to write the same thing 10 different times in 10 slightly different ways and have all of them actually sound good. I would know. I'll write a single sentence in a single way and it'll still sound stupid. It also doesn't help that maybe a response from a character at one stage should also take into account that the other character made them angry 3 lines ago, so either this is pulled off by making all of the dialogue kind of non-specific so that it can fit with a bunch of different choices, or it's just not pulled off at all and the characters will start randomly changing their attitude towards stuff in the middle of a conversation. Also, because these actors need to sometimes read tens of thousands of voice lines for these games, their performances come off flat and unenthused. It's really apparent that they're just in a booth ripping out voice lines one after another trying to get it done with. And at some point, sometimes that leads to some really jarring moments, like when a character's voice changes entirely.
Nice village.
Aye,
A real pearl of the swamps.
if you say so.
You get by all right?
These games lose the passion and dynamic performances that pull you into characters in movies or TV or even other games that have advanced mocap, and it's also, I'd argue, worse than just reading dialogue in text form. It's more convenient when somebody's actually saying it, but instead of me being able to fill in the gaps of the performance with my own imagination, the gaps are being filled in for me, but in the most uninspired way. This is capped off by the horribly stilted animations you see in these games, especially in moments where you're interacting with a specific character and getting heaps of exposition dumped in your general direction, where you have these canned movements that repeat themselves and the characters just sway around and give off zero life. I don't think the animators or actors or anything in these games are bad, but the RPG structure leads to some dark moments in these departments. If we look at the Game Awards nominees over the past 5 years for Best Performance, we can see that only 3 of the 25 come from RPGs, and none of these nominees actually won. But just in general, I think it's really easy to tell the difference between an actor, even when they're given a lot of lines, who has solid direction and an attempt to hide potentially awkward looking dialogue scenes through clever methods.
Whole thing is pretty much done. We're more ghosts than people.
And even a good actress like Ashley Birch, who's basically just asked to read thousands of lines and get them out of the way.
Oh, are you gonna shut your mouth? Because that would be a surprise.
I think two things can help this. One, more games need to pull a Ghost of Tsushima or a Red Dead/GTA and give you something else to look at during these less important dialogue scenes, because the second I see this bullshit, my brain turns off. I don't care about any of it. Two, give the player choice in some dialogue sections, but it doesn't have to be basically every single sentence. Put these long expositions in text form for the player to read, even if the info is just an audio log or something and it's still being read with a deadpan voice. At least it's not shoved into the middle of what should be a higher quality part of the game. And only prompt choices once the player can make even an eek of a difference. Doing a long contrived dance for no reason to end up at the same spot no matter what, and in the process each path becomes less interesting than it would have been, just does not feel like a smart way to give the player options in a high quality story. Also, I would say focus player choices almost solely on side quests, because that's where you can actually make them matter. There's a reason so many people, including me, love the Bloody Baron quest from The Witcher 3. It feels like every choice you make has an actual impact, and it actually tests your own personal morality. How much you trust certain people, who do you have an allegiance to. It's amazing because you can alter so many outcomes, and the main story of The Witcher 3 pales in comparison, because in that, only a handful of choices truly matter in terms of the main ending, and everything is way more spaced out. If you give the player 10 side missions with 3 big choices each, they can be self-contained. You only have to juggle a few of the player's decisions at any one time, and you have to write 80 endings, which sounds like a lot, but if the same amount of choices you had in those 10 one-hour missions are put into 10 hours of the main campaign, you get over 1 billion endings. That is the difference we're talking about here. Design more side quests that make my choices matter, because it's infinitely easier to do so, and then I have less of a problem with the many unnecessary empty choices in the main game. The well-written side quest that had a lot of options was the only reason that I spent 80 hours in a game that I clearly have a lot of issues with personally. This is a long video, and this is a sad video. I normally don't like talking about the stuff that I dislike. I'll do it sometimes, but usually I'm trying to put a spotlight on games that I really enjoy, so it felt weird just rattling out reasons why I dislike something, especially since I know a lot of people really enjoy the stuff that I'm ragging on. But like I said in the beginning, I would love to have my mind changed. I want to hear from fans of this genre why I should care about them, what positives am I missing, and what negatives am I just looking at with a bad lens. I guess to sum up my problems, I think RPGs try way too hard to approach infinite possibilities to convince the player they have full agency, but then a lot of the things they do become very saturated. Your choices have less meaning, your exploration is more barren, the game feels flat to play, and you get certain mechanics that just exist for the sake of existing and nothing else. I think part of that needs to be fixed on the game's end, and part of it needs to be fixed on my end with how I approach these games. So seriously, leave your personal thoughts down in the comments. I want to read them whether you agree with me or not. Maybe you have other issues that bug you in these games that I didn't get to, so you can let me know about those as well. Also, since you're at the end, if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and go check out some of the playlists in my description. And I'll see you all next time. Peace.